All right, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming along tonight. I'm Sarah Wilson, and I'm the head of School of Psychological Sciences here at the university, and I'd like to welcome you all to the university this evening. In doing so, I also acknowledge the elders and descendants of the Wurundjeri people who have been and are the custodians of these lands. We acknowledge that the land on which we meet tonight was the place of age-old ceremonies, of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. So this is a very exciting night for our school and the university, as here on the eve of World Mental Health Day, we are launching our new series of PsychTalks that we hope that you all will continue to be part of. Now, I realise we're stepping away from the stereotype of a psych who typically nods and listens. Tonight we are going to discuss and we're going to explore new ideas. This is this forum for conversation. And that's the point of this whole series. We hope to bring to you, through this series, engaging conversations with world-leading researchers and subject matter experts, speaking on topics that are relevant and affect us all in one way or another. Now, I think what's particularly special for this series for our school is a chance to engage with our partners. And our school shares a vision with our partners, which overall, if we were to try and capture that, is to better the lives of people with mental health issues. And it's very much our view that we do a far better job and have a much stronger impact if we work together collaboratively to address the many challenges that we're currently facing around mental health in the community. Tonight our focus is on stigma, but we're going to explore a range of different topics over the series. And so I'd particularly like to thank our partners who are here with us tonight, including SANE, Lifeline and Wellways. They're participating in the panel, as this event would not be possible without them. And so we really look forward to a shared collaboration going further as we advance mental health research. I'd now like to hand over and introduce you to our MC for the night, the very capable Paul Barclay, who you probably will recognise by his voice. He was telling me about that earlier. That's the only way he's recognised by people. We're very honoured to have him here tonight. He is a Walkley Award-winning journalist and a broadcaster with a very big appetite for ideas and in-depth discussion around issue, and currently hosts the very popular ABC Big Ideas program. Thank you, Paul.
Welcome this evening to the PsychTalks discussion on stamping out stigma. It's a great pleasure to be here as somebody who's recently taken an interest in this subject for personal reasons, but also professional ones as well. We run a lot of talks on big ideas about mental health issues, so it's particularly great to be talking about this specific issue tonight. It's being recorded for Big Ideas on ABCRN, Monday to Thursday nights at 8, available on podcast as well. It'll be up and about this discussion in the next few weeks, so check out our Twitter feed, and I'll also widely publicise it when we do schedule it. I think we'd like to think that as a society we've come a long way in attitudes toward mental health and mental illness, but how far have we come? A few years ago, the head of Beyond Blue warned that Australians who revealed a mental illness to their employer could face the sack or miss out on a promotion. makes you wonder how much has changed. I think all too often those experiencing mental health issues face fear and judgment when their condition or its symptoms become apparent. The stigma attached to complex mental illness, which we're going to be talking about tonight, can discourage people from seeking help, and this can have a major effect on treatment outcomes. It can lead to exclusion, discrimination, a lack of social support, poorer quality of life, and low self-esteem. So we're going to be looking at how do we destigmatise mental illness, and what a wonderful panel of speakers we have with us tonight. On my immediate left is Alan Woodward, the recently retired Executive Director, Research and Strategy at Lifeline Australia, although Alan is still in this space doing other work. Next to Alan, Liz Crowther, the CEO of Wellways. Next to Liz, we have Osher Gunsberg, television and radio personality, podcaster. Osher's podcast, by the way, that also happens to be on the ABC website, Tall Tales But True. Google it, it's fantastic. He tells his story, I think you'll hear part of it tonight, and he's also on the Sane Australia board. Next to Osher, we have Dr. Chris Groot, academic. Did I say Groot? Chris Groot, academic at the Melbourne School of Psychological Science at the University of Melbourne. And at the end of the panel, Dr. Michelle Blanchard, the Deputy CEO of Sane. Please make our panel welcome. So, Chris, I'll come to you first of all. What do we mean when we talk about the stigma associated with mental illness? Where does this stigma come from? What's the root of it, if you like?
That's a really good question, the root. Well, if we wanted to go to the root of stigma, we'd go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, this is where we really think of the concept of stigma originating from. We used to physically brand traitors or undesirable people in the community with a mark that would indicate that this person was fundamentally flawed, there was something wrong with them, they were undesirable and to be avoided. And so really this is the gist of what we talk about when we talk about stigma, an idea that an experience, and in this case tonight we're talking about mental illness, is undesirable, is associated with being flawed in some way and should be avoided. The way in which this plays out would be, typically we think of stigma in four ways. We think of it in terms of structural stigma, which is stigma manifest at the societal level. It's manifest in terms of institutional policies, practices and laws that discriminate against groups, certain subgroups, and in this case would be talking about people with mental illness. Next, we think about public stigma, and public stigma is thought to be the driving force behind institutional stigma and all other facets of stigma, actually. So when we talk about public stigma, we're talking about stereotyped attitudes, negative stereotyped attitudes, prejudicial emotional responses, and discriminatory behaviours about mental illness. So, for example, some of the big stereotypes that are particularly problematic around severe and complex mental illness might be that people with lived experience of these illnesses are unpredictable and are dangerous. And in response, one might have the emotional response of fear. And the way that this would play out then behaviourally would be that you would distance yourself socially from that person with lived experience of mental illness. Next would be self-stigma, and this is stigma experienced by the person with lived experience of mental illness, and that could be in terms of the direct negative effects of discrimination, being denied employment, being discriminated against in terms of having difficulty accessing housing or support services, in terms of maintaining intimate interpersonal relationships and so forth. And you can imagine, and if one has those experiences, then one begins to become anxious in anticipation of having those experiences in the future down the track.
And self-stigma, I would imagine, is related to public stigma. People stigmatise themselves, presumably,
Yes.
because they imagine that the public is seeing that there's something wrong with them.
Oh, I've lost my microphone. I should have gone for that tape, Osher.
It's all right.
So, yeah.
If you read my book, you'll know I used to be a roadie.
Oh, good. I'm halfway through it.
Hang on. Stand by.
So, yeah, you're absolutely right, Paul. That is another aspect of self-stigma. We've all grown up, whether we have a lived experience of mental illness or not, in a culture in which we are aware that mental illness is stigmatised. Now, if you're aware of that, if you develop an experience of mental illness, you will have that process of internalisation, of considering that, oh gosh, I'm showing features of that thing that's undesirable. I don't want to admit that to myself. I don't want to seek help for fear of what might happen, and so forth. And then lastly, we've also got stigma by association, which is very similar to self-stigma, but for people who are carers or family members or friends of those with mental illness.
I'll just say to Melissa, the ABC tech, that if she needs to come and fix up the microphone of Chris, this is going to be edited out, by the way, feel free to do so. I'll let you make a judgment as to whether his mic is picking it up sufficiently. I think, Michelle, it was interesting what Chris was saying, and just to add to that, I would imagine that the more complex and challenging the mental health condition is, like, say, schizophrenia, the greater level of stigma and fear that gets attached to it. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's often because we don't know as much about some of these complex experiences that people have. But also that not as many of us have had the opportunity to directly connect with somebody who might have had an experience of psychosis or of a personality disorder or a complex eating disorder. So we don't know as much about them, and therefore we can be a little bit afraid or apprehensive about those experiences. We've done such a great job over the last 20 years in terms of destigmatising things like depression and anxiety, but we've still got an enormous way to go when it comes to those more complex conditions.
Liz, I'm going to bring Osher in a moment, but before I do, is there anything that you'd like to add as someone who's in the community trying to address stigma through your Wellways program, and we will talk about that at length later on, but anything you'd like to add at this point?
That the conversation that Chris was having about it affects the person, the family and the community is absolutely what we experience on a daily basis. And the terror that both the family and the person themselves who is developing a psychotic illness experiences delays opportunities for intervention for quite some years.
So, Osher, you've been very open about your battles with anxiety, with OCD, social phobia, psychotic episode that you talk about in one of the podcasts. From your vantage point, how real is the stigma that's attached to mental illness, and how did it impact on you?
Well, firstly, hearing Chris talk, then I have this extraordinarily privileged position. I mean, I'm not only white, male, straight, middle class. I'm also a person that's been in the public eye for nearly 20 years. Yeah. So I have this kind of the level of familiarity and trust is already there when people see my face. And then so when I tell them, I don't know, I was experiencing paranoid delusions, I was seeing things that weren't there, their reaction is often curiosity rather than fear, because hang on, I know this person. Okay. And that's, for me, it's an extraordinarily privileged place to be able to then have a conversation and then get in there and start. Because if they didn't know me, it'd be the same thing, and we've all felt that, like when everyone in this room knows we've lost someone to suicide. Everybody in this room, absolutely. And the first time it happens, you almost don't want to talk to the family because you're so afraid. That's stigma. Because we're afraid, we don't know what to say, we don't know what to do. And that's exactly the same thing. And it's funny hearing Chris talk about the self-stigma. I was telling Michelle, I was texting her on the way here today, I've been off medication, I've been off all the meds for about 10 months now, and I'm managing, I'm not, I manage, but without meds. And I got incredibly triggered today. And I was so afraid that I was going to slip back down. I was so afraid. I didn't want to get on the plane. I didn't want to pick up my phone. I was like, oh, it's going to happen again. It's going to happen again. And exactly what Liz was just saying was like preventing me from like, and this is all within me. But thankfully I know enough to connect, call my family, call my wife, and just kind of, it's okay, just keep doing the things I know how to do, and that stuff will eventually recede.
When you first became aware that you had a problem,
yes,
did you delay seeking treatment because of the stigma that you thought might be attached to what you thought the problem was?
Oh, absolutely. I was first offered medication in 1999, and I said, it's cool, doc. I'll just have a couple of beers and I'll be right. I'm here to tell you that my alcohol-based management strategy was not a very clever one. I've been sober 8.5 years now. But yeah, and when I finally did end up taking the meds, it was just garden variety SSRI, and about 2007 I started on those. I lamented I'd wasted 10 years of my life, but I was so afraid to be someone that had to take meds. But even then, when I was told to have the antipsychotics, like here's this drug, it's an antipsychotic, have it on the really bad days, and I performed a magic trick of the mentally ill as old as psychiatry itself. I got told to have this only if I really need it. Therefore, if I don't take it, I don't need it, therefore I don't have psychosis. Brilliant.
Yeah.
I did still, and I really needed it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't want to have to take that. Absolutely.
See, it's interesting because I heard you talking about this, and you were saying that you'd reached a point. Well, this is what you said on the podcast. You'd reached a point where you accepted that you needed to take medication every day. But it sounds to me like that was not a full acceptance, in a sense, that you at that point needed to take it, but your goal was to see if you could move forward psychologically without medication. And the reason I ask that is because there is, for some people, a stigma attached to taking the medication as well as to the condition itself.
Absolutely, 100%. And I would say to that person, and the analogy is pretty clear. You wouldn't walk into the doctor with a broken arm and say, it's cool, doc, I'll be right without the cast. I can sort this out, and then live the rest of your life with this bone protruding out of it. No, you'd put the cast on. You'd get the support you needed while you healed. And it's the same, it's exactly the same thing. But yes, I didn't want it, but I had to, gratefully, I was able to get to that point that the pain was so great within me. It was so much greater than I had to wait for the pain to get so much greater than the fear of taking the meds. That was the thing. But that's how all change is, isn't it? When the pain of staying the same becomes so great, then it becomes greater than the fear of change, then you change.
I mean, you had a massively successful career on television. I mean, you're a recognisable person. You walk out in the street and people know you because of The Bachelor and because of Australian Idol and so on. Does that make it especially hard for you battling a mental illness, or, as you said earlier, easier because people will, in a sense, sit down and listen to you because they feel a trust?
How hard it is for me is I don't think it's relevant at this point. I have a very robust self-care protocol. Thankfully, I'm on the board of Sane Australia, so I can call them and go, I need help because I'm talking about it all the time. Can you help me? And so they've trained me up with their peer program, which is a great program. I am privileged that I get to carry a message of, what this illness can look like. Because so many people have an idea of what psychosis is. But there I was every Wednesday and Thursday night counting roses in their living room, and they were looking straight at it. And they were making fun of me because I'm busting out of my suits. That's because I'm putting on 1 kilo a week because I'm on the Seroquel. But there I was in front of them, like, oh, okay, so that's what it could be. That's what it might look like. It doesn't have to be the person that is depicted in, whatever Netflix show they're watching or, whatever book they're reading. It's not that. It can, and I can tell you right now, there are people in this room who are on these meds, and we don't need to know because they're managing just fine.
Psychosis and paranoid delusions is pretty scary stuff, isn't it?
I don't recommend it.
Yeah. And people are subsequently scared of people that they feel are in the grip of that type of mental illness. Did you feel judged by the fact that you were in that position?
No, I didn't. And that's the thing. It's what Chris was talking about earlier. Everything in your brain tells you a few things. Number one, you're the only person that feels like this. Number two, this is going to last forever. And number three, people are going to be weird if you tell them. None of those three things are true. Everyone who reached out to us said, I need help, were just nothing but kind and compassionate and caring for me. Because, you know, let's face it, if your loved one said, hey, I'm having a really frightening day, I'm afraid of these things that you can't see or hear, but they're real to me, you'd be, okay, let's go to the doctor.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to not help them.
Yeah, absolutely. So Michelle, SANE has been working in this space for over 30 years, since the wonderful Anne Devison helped to set up your foundation over 3 decades ago, and what an incredible Australian she was, what incredible foresight and courage she had to focus attention on this. How much does it help having someone like Osher, given his profile, talk about this stuff in terms of breaking down the stigma that clearly still does exist around complex mental illness?
Absolutely. It's incredibly important. And, you know, we've been so grateful to Osher, but also to all of the people over the history of SANE as an organisation who have been courageous in sharing their own stories and their families' stories. So, you know, if you think back to the 1980s when SANE Australia was established, for those of you who don't know or didn't know, Anne Devison, she was a broadcaster and journalist. She was a social activist, and her son Jonathan lived with schizophrenia at a time where public perception of schizophrenia was that it was caused by bad parenting, and namely being a bad mother. So for someone like Anne to stand up and tell her family's story, and then to create a space for other people with lived experience of mental illness to tell their stories as well, was an incredibly powerful thing. Unfortunately, I think over the last 30 years, we've tended to focus a little bit more on the stories of people who've experienced depression and anxiety. There aren't as many Oshers out there willing to share stories of living with experiences of psychosis or complex post-traumatic stress disorder or binge eating disorder, for example. They're not the mental illnesses that we talk about commonly. And so the more that we can get those stories out in the open, the more we can build empathy and understanding for those experiences and reduce stigma in the community.
Yeah. Alan, let me bring you into the discussion. Up until recently, you were working with Lifeline, which offers telephone and web-based crisis support and counselling, a tremendously important service that's been so valuable to so many people at critical points in their life. You have a lot of experience in this field, even though you no longer work at Lifeline. How do these services specifically help those who are going through a very bad time, but also maybe feel stigmatised about what they're feeling?
Yeah, look, and there's some interesting things really about the history of these so-called teleweb or now digital services, which emerged from the 1950s on. And back in the 1950s and 60s, the telephone was emerging technology. You know, it was only in the 1960s in Australia you started to have most households have a telephone. And people wondered, well, why would people seek help using the telephone? It was a really novel idea. But interestingly, people do seek help from a telephone. And if you fast forward to recent times, one of the studies that was undertaken on the Lifeline online chat service showed that 1/3 almost, 30% of the users of the chat service stated that they would not use another service at all in seeking help. So there's something peculiar, if you like, about these teleweb or digital services that opens a door for people to seek help. And maybe it's because of the friendly listening voice at the end of the phone or the responsive person on the chat or text service. Maybe it's also because the person who's using that service has more control. And if you like, the power dynamic has changed from having to go into a room and front up to a professional to being able to determine the terms on which you engage in your help-seeking process. Maybe it's also because of the offer of a confidential interaction where people can start to disclose things about themselves which they may not otherwise disclose. Now, another piece of research that I've been involved in with my colleague Avis Middleton, we found that 60% of the people who call Lifeline state that the key reason for doing so is they have no one else that they feel they can comfortably confide in. So this is part of the other thing, I guess, about the way stigma plays out, is that people struggle to make these disclosures, and yet in a tele-web environment, which is very confidential, you can make disclosures. But I think the other thing that's quite interesting about it is that we also now do like to self-direct how we address issues in our lives. And part of the other thing around the way stigma plays out in our community is that there are all manner of people who are prepared to give their advice and tell you what you should do or shouldn't do. And I know that in my experience, I've been a volunteer with Lifeline as well as a paid worker. I've listened to people on the phones, and I've had the privilege of meeting many people with lived experience over the years to provide me with advice and insights. And one of the things that really irks people is when someone else is trying to tell them how they should live with their mental illness, or what they should be doing, or how they should live their lives. And there's still the attitude in our society with people experiencing depression that they should just get over it. It's appeared in our media even in quite recent times. Whereas one of the benefits of these teleweb services, even back from their very origins as a way of breaking out of the mould, is that they allow an environment where the person themselves can start to work things through.
Can you in effect sidestep some of the stigma by virtue of the fact that it's anonymous?
I think it's a big factor, I really do. And it's one of the things that time and time again people who use teleweb services are communicating back as feedback is important. If I can give one example, and that is of another service, MindSpot, which is again a national teleweb service in this country which specialises in depression and anxiety treatments. And it provides both a mix of self-directed education tools online and telephone-based support. And it's been operating now for about 5, 6, 7 years. Now, MindSpot, when it first started up, we're getting a whole lot of people come in with anxiety issues in their lives, many of whom had been living with anxiety for more than a decade and had never found a way to seek help. Now, when you think about it, if you're experiencing high levels of anxiety, it's going to be very hard for you to make an appointment to go and see someone in a room and face-to-face front them and talk about your anxiety. So it's like almost, maybe it wasn't that surprising that suddenly this service, MindSpot, lit up a whole lot of opportunities. But the tragedy about it is you'd have people who, as I said, had lived with anxiety for more than 10 years before they could find a safe place to seek help.
So these teleweb services would frequently be, I imagine, the first port of call for people who have perhaps been experiencing mental illness for a considerable length of time, get to crisis point and ring you up. That's a full-on responsibility, isn't it? And they're touching you at a time when they're incredibly vulnerable, and they're doing so because they feel they can, because they're not going to be judged, because the person on the other end of the phone doesn't even know who they're talking to.
Look, absolutely, Paul. I mean, these teleweb services, in my opinion, should be seen as a core piece of infrastructure service in the wider health system. They should be just built in as part of the model. And if I can share with you an experience I had last year, I had the privilege of travelling to Ukraine. And Ukraine is a country which is going through a lot of difficulties, including dealing with a large part of their population now that are essentially war veterans, and a recovery approach around that. But interestingly, the Minister for Health in Ukraine is building a national teleweb support service as part of the design of health system reform in that country, because they know the importance of putting that offer of help out in an accessible way for people to come to as that initial point of seeking help.
Yeah. Chris, do you agree that because of the anonymity and confidentiality of a service like Lifeline, that people feel freer to come forward and talk about their issues without the stigma? Really?
Yeah, absolutely. So Alan and I have previously been colleagues in the teleweb industry. I used to govern a number of large teleweb services, the Suicide Callback Service and Suicide Line Victoria and the Defence Force Mental Health Services and whatnot. And yes, absolutely the same sorts of stories that Alan has heard about people putting off going to see a mental health professional for a variety of reasons, and certainly surrounding stigma was certainly a very consistent theme in our evaluation data as well. People that have been living with suicide risk on a daily basis for a very long time and had been reluctant to seek face-to-face help would be, we found, more likely to engage with the teleweb service in the first instance. And potentially that would then act as a gateway to seeking face-to-face help. But I completely agree with Alan. Seeing an integrated teleweb mental health service nationally, I think is just a fundamental requirement moving forward.
I'm going to come to Liz in a minute, but just one more question, Alan. Is it ultimately the goal of Lifeline to get the people that you're helping at the point of crisis to go and have face-to-face counselling, to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist? Is that the role of your counsellors, or not necessarily?
No, it's not necessarily, and I think for any teleweb service, each service is going to make a certain service offer and you deal with the needs of people and the parameters. But I will make one point, and that is that the Lifeline helpline in this country, as is the case with the US National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, as National Crisis Line there, often find themselves providing referrals to other community-based services. So there is this pathway aspect to the teleweb environment. And often what a person does need in longer term support is community-based. So when I made the point about seeing these teleweb services as vital infrastructure in the overall system, it's not that they're trying to replace or replicate the professional services, the clinical services, the community mental health, but rather it's a way of seeing a model through which people can move seamlessly. And they might come in through a teleweb door, they might go to a community mental health service, they might at some stage need acute care, and they might come back to a teleweb service for continuing support and follow-up. I mean, it doesn't need to be an either-or proposition.
Liz, there's no substitute for sitting down and having a conversation with somebody who's living the experience of a mental illness, and I have some people close to me, and it's helped me a lot in terms of becoming much more aware of the challenges they face and indeed my response to those challenges. Talk about how Wellways brings members of the local community into contact with people who have lived experience of complex mental illnesses, because I think this is a really important job that you're doing.
Thanks very much. I can't but support Alan's proposition that people come in various doors, and we must create those various doors. And I'm going to enter into this conversation in a different way. Contact is an essential part that we all have as human beings. And our model of care is, as I said earlier, the person, their family, and the community in which they live. And we have been at this game for now 40 years. But one of the things that we really thought about very deeply was, if we're going to make a difference in this environment, we need to look at our employment practices and what do we do in our organisation to live this idea. We currently employ about 150 people. That's people who are employed because of their mental illness, not people who have a mental illness as part of their lives, but 150 people in our organisation who are employed because of their experience of psychotic illness. And what that reinforces is this idea of meeting people regularly, meeting them in ways that you expect valuable contributions from them, creating relationships with people as friends, as colleagues, and as family members. Those people, from time to time, have events when their illnesses are not great. or I should say it differently, when their health is not great. So it's creating an environment in our organisation where our organisation actually has to tailor itself around health promotion and being clear that because I'm employing somebody for the specific reason that they have a mental health history or a mental ill health history, that the staff working with that people have specific supports and opportunities to understand the value of that person. Was mentioned.
So you're walking the walk, basically.
Yeah, yes.
You're not just talking the talk about mental health stigma, you're putting it into practice in a workplace situation.
Absolutely. If I was mentioned before about housing, we run a particular program, only in Victoria, whereby we work with real estate agents and we work to get people housing. If you're aware of the challenge in housing today, you'll know that if you're on a pension and trying to get public housing, you might wait 7 years or 10. We've adopted a model, out of New York, which says we can actually house you effectively in rental properties. So we have a strategy around that. When we started it, I thought, oh my God, I really am pushing this uphill. We didn't think that we would get support from the real estate agents. And we challenged and worked closely with the REIV and with real estate agents to help us place people in rental accommodation. There's a challenge, there's a strategy, a recipe, if you like, about what that program looks like. But we've now been operating that program for 8 years, and real estate agents ring us up and say, have you got any more people looking for housing? Now, 8 years ago, would I have thought that was possible? Absolutely no. I would have been likely to say, the person next door to you has probably got a mental health issue, and try and go that way.
How on earth did you get real estate agents to that point? What were the conversations that led up to the point? Because maybe it's my jaundiced view of real estate agents, but something major has changed from their stereotyping that invariably would have existed to the point where they're willing to have a go.
Firstly, they're people. Now, I didn't think that when we started this program, but we actually provided information. We said that we will be with that person, the lease will be taken out in the person's name, that we would support that person if they weren't paying rent or if there was any damage done to the house. So we addressed the concerns that real estate agents have. And we said, we will be there to support you. And we held our breath. And we got 2 agents on board, 3 agents on board, and now we've got a whole suite of agents on board. I think of Terrelgan, and we go past the real estate agent there who comes out and waves and has a conversation with the people who are renting. So there is a process of that person feeling included in their community and having a positive relationship with the real estate agents. It hasn't changed views where there is not this program happening, because remember, real contact with real people about real things makes a difference in people's lives.
Because people become human beings then,
absolutely,
don't they? Osher, I was wondering about your experience in the workplace. The media can be a pretty unforgiving industry. You're hot one day, you're not hot the next. How did the media industry deal with the fact that, you'd suffered this illness?
By and large, everyone has been pretty cool with it. I write about it in the book. I was in New York with a camera crew on September 11th, 2001, and a few days before that we were caught in a riot in Los Angeles where we were very, very lucky to escape. My cameraman was quite badly injured, and it was really pretty full on. Anyway, I came back and I was diagnosed with PTSD. I was just sitting, I just sat at my desk and I just stared at the wall. When I was on camera, everything was fine, but I just sat at my desk and stared at the wall, and my boss walked past and go, "You okay?" And it took me everything, but just to say, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
And gratefully, they had a workplace program there, and they organised a psych for me to go and see, and I saw a great treatment with him, and I was, went and saw him for about a year, and the same thing with Network 10 and Warner Brothers when things started to go pear-shaped for me in 2014, and I turned up for the second season of Bachelor. I'm like, look, this is what's going on.
Yep.
This is how I'm managing it, and without a doubt, I've found at all points, as long as I say, here's what's happening, here's the steps that I take to manage it, don't worry, I'll still be able to do the job. And as long as they can see that I've got a management plan in place, and I'm actively doing what is in my power to take control of this, not doing anything stupid, and that I do the job, that everyone's been fine.
Yeah.
Everyone's been fine. I'd imagine, that makes them feel a little more comfortable. It's like, oh, he's got it. He's got it. And he goes to see a doctor all the time. He's close with his family, and he's definitely got things in place that if anything goes wrong, he's okay.
I mean, I think, Michelle, in my industry, in journalism, it's taken us a while to actually get to the point where we acknowledge that what we're sending journalists out into as war correspondents is very full on. And it's full on, it's over a long period of time, but you layer on top of that the stoicism, the masculinity sometimes, the kind of overt sense of wanting to project a sense of courage, and also a sense of, I'm just a journalist, really. I've got a job, I'm getting paid, I'm not actually a victim here.
Yep.
All of that compounds to the point where people don't feel as if they should seek assistance for their mental health problems. And you find, we found it in our organisation, the ABC, people come back home and they don't cope very well, and we are a lot better at dealing with it now. Is that generally the case? Do you think that we are getting a lot better at dealing with that now?
So I think certainly we're having more open conversations in lots of workplaces about mental health and wellbeing. I still think we have a long way to go. And when I speak to some of our SANE peer ambassadors, and we go out through our research work and connect with people with lived experience of mental illness, we still hear some pretty harrowing tales. One of the areas where I think, similar to journalism, there is a bit of a stoicism is in the health sector. And I think, one of the things that we need to get a lot better at in the helping professions is identifying and naming and sharing our own experiences of mental ill health as a way of breaking down those barriers. So, certainly for me, I've worked in the mental health sector and been involved in the mental health sector since I was 17. And I certainly would say that there were periods in my life when I experienced some mental health challenges where I didn't feel like I could share that with my colleagues. In an organisation where everyone was absolutely supportive and they would have completely understood and been really helpful and positive. But I think, in my brain, I'd been at this university for 8 years. I'd worked really hard and I wanted to be taken seriously for my professional background, and I should have had it all together. I should have been able to manage all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And when we connect with people who are doctors and psychologists and social workers and OTs, they often feel the same way. So I think that's one example of a profession where, we need to get a little bit better at being a bit more authentic about our own experiences, and then using that. It's an enormous tool to connect with other people. You develop a real sense of empathy for other people's experiences, and I think there's a really powerful opportunity there for us to challenge things.
Yeah.
We work a lot with people who work in emergency rooms, for example, who are working with people with quite complex mental health difficulties. There's a story that came up in a project recently. We looked at personality disorder, which is one of the most poorly understood categories of mental illness in this country. A woman presented to an emergency room with a physical injury, completely unrelated to her experience of mental ill health. Presented at the emergency room, her medical file was sought, and on it were the words borderline personality disorder. And she wasn't encouraged to have an X-ray for her injury. She was sent home with a Panadol and to have a bit of a rest. Presented to her GP. The GP said, oh, you know, actually I think you should go back to emergency. Happened again. Once borderline personality disorder was seen on the medical file, sent back home.
Yeah.
Turned out this person had a really serious injury. So, you know, this kind of assumption, even in professions where we think perhaps our understanding should be a little bit better, I think we've still got a fair way to go.
Well, it's something we don't really talk about, Chris, is it? The fact that the stigma can exist within the medical profession itself, with among the very people who we imagine are there to help those people with a mental illness.
Oh, absolutely. And borderline personality disorder is the classic case, and what you're describing there about clients with borderline personality disorder receiving delays in accessing treatment or being turned away is really well described in the literature. It's a particularly stigmatised clinical presentation in primary healthcare and even in mental health care. There's literature that's documented this in the face-to-face literature. And it's a particularly interesting challenge because quite often the presentation clinically can involve quite concerning behaviours and distressing presentations involving self-harm, threats of suicide, rage reactions, and difficulty regulating emotions and whatnot. And it can be quite challenging to work with clinically. And potentially because of these features, we see in healthcare staff that there may be stigmatised attitudes towards these features and also this personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. One problem with borderline personality disorder that's very common is a fear of abandonment.
Yeah.
Now, this presents a particular problem for this clinically, in that if I stigmatise borderline personality disorder and I have stereotyped attitudes about this disorder and I observe distressing symptoms, I'm then going to distance myself in the therapeutic alliance, which is then going to trigger that fear of abandonment and exacerbate symptoms, and around we go, and this becomes a vicious cycle.
This brings us to the issue that it's been suggested that one of the ways, therefore, that you deal with stigma that attaches to certain mental illnesses is you simply relabel the mental illness. So you no longer call schizophrenia, you think of another name for it, a name that doesn't have the stigma that's already attached to it. You've been examining this hypothesis at your Stigma lab here at Melbourne University. Can you give us an idea of that research and what you're finding?
That's right. It's actually this very topic that captured my attention, and what originally started as a bit of an interesting side project in research ended up being what's becoming a primary research stream and the foundation of our Stigma lab. And I see Kelton up the back here, our PhD student, who's also looking at stigma about severe and complex mental illness, and some very complementary work to that which Sane is doing. So Kelton's looking at stigma towards schizophrenia and how the media and reporting might perpetuate that, and perceptions of violence and criminality. But to come back to relabelling, yes, the idea is that there's something about the labels themselves, these diagnostic labels, that is stigmatising in and of itself. With schizophrenia, this is the prime example, the argument goes that over a century of misleading and sensationalist representations in pop culture and in news media, we have the label itself has become a driver of stigma. It's associated, we go to, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, ingrained in our collective cultural psyche. When we hear Psycho, is a butcher knife behind a shower curtain, these sorts of damaging representations. So the idea is that if you change the label to a new label that's devoid of all of those negative associations, then maybe stigma is reduced as a result. So there's been a couple of different types of labels that have been proposed in the literature as suitable replacements for schizophrenia. One would be an informative label that's descriptive. The idea behind an informative label is that a little bit of psychoeducation can be demystifying and educational and reduce stigma. So an example of an informative label would be something like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That label tells you clearly about what's going on with that experience. It's more challenging to do with schizophrenia because schizophrenia comes in many different forms.
Yeah.
There's a broad range of symptoms, including hallucinations and delusions, thought disorder, behavioural and affective dysfunction as well. There's a broad range of symptoms. It's very hard to get one label that could encapsulate all the possible different presentations meaningfully and accurately, and I would suggest that it's probably not possible. So an alternative is to go with an eponym, an eponymous label, which is where you would draw upon generally the name of a prominent researcher or clinician. So Alzheimer's disease is an example of this. And it's actually very easy to experimentally investigate whether or not an alternative label would work. Funnily enough, the literature is very theoretical, it's very opinion-based, and there's very little experimental work. So this is really our niche and where we started to form the foundation of the Stigma Lab here in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. It's very simple. Well,
I was just going to interrupt and say, it also raises the question about whether it's the label that causes the stigma or whether it's the behaviour associated to the illness that causes the
exactly.
stigma.
So through numerous replications now, we've compared eponyms and informative labels and schizophrenia as a label. Very easy to do. If I was to run an experiment tonight, I could split the auditorium into groups, and don't worry, we're not going to do anything.
Although it is a good opportunity, actually,
well, it is
to
really,
conduct some research.
And I could get you, each person in each group, to read the same story about somebody with schizophrenia. The symptoms would be the same, the demographics would be the same, the age and the sex and so forth. Everything would be the same except for the label. I'd give maybe this half of the auditorium the label of schizophrenia in the story sporadically, and this half of the auditorium maybe something like integration dysregulation disorder. We've tried this one. And then afterwards, I'd ask you about your stigmatised attitudes, emotions, and likely behavioural responses to the protagonist in the story. And we could compare and see if there was any differences. And as a function of label, our evidence would suggest that no, it's not the label that's making any meaningful contribution to stigma, but what we've found is that different symptoms, different illness factors tend to elicit stigma in different ways. Hallucinations and delusions tend to elicit perceptions of violence, of unpredictability, endorsement of forced treatment, and so forth. And various illness phases as well, active illness phases versus remitted illness phases will elicit stigma in different ways. So acknowledging that schizophrenia is so diverse and psychosis more broadly is so diverse, we've established an ongoing program of research which is systematically mapping stigmatised responses to symptoms and symptom subtypes. And our grand plan is to map it all so that in turn we can have a very accurately targeted intervention which could then hopefully decrease public stigma. And of course that's where sane and well ways and so forth would come into play, of course, as we move along. We're very cognizant that we need to walk hand in hand with this journey because ultimately we'd like to translate that intervention to a real world.
Osho wanted to come in and make a comment on that, actually.
Just what you talk about not labelling it. When I first presented in Los Angeles was when I got really ill. The psychiatrist I went to go and see, for the first 10 weeks, wouldn't tell me what was going on with me, wouldn't give a name to it. He said, here, take the Zyprexa, take the Wellbutrin, take this many milligrams, actually take a few more milligrams, but wouldn't tell me what was going on because I was experiencing quite active and passive suicidal ideation. I was in a great deal of danger. And after about 10 weeks, I said, what's going on with me? He goes, all right, well, you've got Usher syndrome. That's what we'll call it. And that's what we ran with until I kind of stabilised, and only then did he kind of give these names to what it was that I was experiencing. I'm actually quite grateful that he did so.
Yeah. But as it turns out, there is no point changing the name of any of those conditions.
Well, for me, this is only one N1, so it's me.
There is a bigger picture, and I will be very brief.
Yeah.
Numerous Asian countries have already changed the name based on the assumption that it would make a difference to stigma. There are some linguistic factors here in that, for example, Japan, who was first to change the name, has got an ideographic language system where it's quite literal meanings. And so the translation of schizophrenia, which was originally very poor in itself, gave a perception of a split mind and a split soul almost.
Yeah.
And with the new label that was introduced, one of the things they found following its introduction was that clinicians were less hesitant to provide the diagnostic label. The problem is that new label will probably become stigmatised as well in time.
You see, whenever I do these discussions and I let my listening public know that I'm about to come out and talk about mental illness, I will invariably get one or several comments prefacing the fact that, it's all about the pathologising of the human condition, that we are all unique individuals, we all see the world in a different way. This idea of normality that gets imposed upon how we behave is false and fake, and that's at the root of where the stigma comes from. If we could just accept that people come... I got another one of those emails before I came here to this session, so I thought I'd just let one of you respond to that view, because undoubtedly you've heard the same thing.
Yeah.
Want to respond?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah.
So I think there can be a bit of a tendency for us to medicalise what's going on for people around their mental health and wellbeing, particularly around things like depression and anxiety. So we can jump to a pharmacological solution, and we can jump to, needing to put people into a particular program of treatment. For me, the most important thing is to listen to what is going on for that individual, and I think that's what services like Lifeline provide in terms of just being able to listen really compassionately to what's going on for that individual. Labels can be helpful for people in terms of getting access to care and support. It's a lot easier to access things like the NDIS or treatment through a psychologist if you've got a label. But I think the important thing is to not let that label brand then the way that we treat that person on an ongoing basis. It's a starting point for a conversation, but it's much more important for us to be listening to what's really going on for that person and to have some empathy and some compassion for what they're going through. So treat the person as an individual, as a human being, rather than as an illness or a label.
Liz, yeah.
One of the things that we found to be very useful is actually following that idea of the person has got a life, and actually, rather than asking what are the symptoms, what do you want to do with your life? What do you want to do? Who do you want in your life? What can we do to support that and provide people with an opportunity to control and have some hope and to have some agency in where they're wanting to go.
Alan, do you get a sense when people have called up Lifeline and they've been dealt with compassionately by trained counsellors, and they've told those counsellors, some pretty full-on stuff, a number of people are right at that edge of suicide, and then they come out the other end. Do you think that very process itself over a long period of time with a lot of people in itself helps to destigmatise in the minds of those people that are going through the mental illness? Oh, I've just had a conversation with someone who's been compassionate and helpful toward me, even though they don't know me from a bar of soap. Do you think that helps destigmatise?
It does undoubtedly. And I guess, the phrase that's often used by people who have had a positive experience of a service such as Lifeline is that they have felt heard.
Yeah.
And, the value and the importance for every person to be able to feel heard is almost a fundamental human right.
Yeah.
But to elaborate on that a bit further, we certainly would go back to, the origins of these teleweb services. And in the UK, the origins were manifested through the Samaritans organisation, which describes what it does as listening therapy. Now, the story of the origin of the Samaritans was that Chad Vara, who was a counsellor and the founder of Samaritans, was running a very busy counselling practice. So people were having to wait to get into an appointment. And he took the initiative to recruit a group of volunteers to simply provide a cup of tea and a biscuit to the people in the waiting room while they were waiting to see a counsellor. And what he discovered after a while was some of the people were coming in to see the counsellors, including himself, saying, well, actually, I had a nice chat to the person out in the waiting room and I feel much better now, so I don't need to see you. I think this is a fundamental thing around our mental health and well-being. All of us have a basic human need to feel heard.
The other thing, Liz, I mean, we've spoken about how contact can change perceptions of real estate agents, of employers, but it can also change the self-perception of the person with the mental illness themselves. They get to realise that by talking to these people who once feared them, who once discriminated against them, and seeing their perception change, that must change the perception of the person with the mental illness themselves.
Absolutely it does. And you'll see the peer movement growing in Australia, and it's exactly through that process that peers have experienced something traumatic in their lives, illness, whatever it is, but being able to talk about that, as you're saying, Alan, the opportunity becomes then, I've learned something I want to give back. And so I thought that, the conversation is, I thought that I was the only one in the world. And, there's literature's replete about this. If you're able to talk to others about the same experience, it makes a difference. We're now discovering that peer therapists or people who are peers who are intervening within people's lives are exceptionally valuable and can have conversations that a professional actually can't have. They're able to say, I've had that experience, get on with it, get on with your life. If you don't move from this spot, you're going to be really stuck. Take the next step.
Storytelling is really powerful, isn't it,
Absolutely.
Osha? Incredibly powerful. And do you feel, I've done thousands of interviews with people in my life, but I don't think that anything quite compares to speaking with someone and sharing in what they've gone through in terms of their battle with mental illness. And as an interviewer, especially these long conversations I have for this program, I feel like I come out the other end almost a different person and with a bond, actually, with that person. Are you feeling the same thing through the sharing of your story as well?
Without a doubt. The power of hearing someone share their story, because like I said earlier, the magic trick of it tries to convince you that no one else knows what this is like and this is how it's going to be forever, which then makes permanent solutions to those problems seem quite viable. Don't do that. And it was actually first in sobriety when I heard another person speak, and I heard another person describe, I'm like that around strangers. I feel that when I go out. I feel, you describe how my last 3 relationships ended. My goodness, you've been peering in my window and watching me. I'm a 36-year-old man, you're a 62-year-old woman from Texas. You have my story. So clearly, but you're better now, clearly you know something that I don't. There's a pathway out of this. And I felt, in learning how to share in that sobriety community that I'm a part of, I learned the power of sharing a story. And then when I heard, similarly with my mental health, when I heard other people actually within that sobriety community go, I'm going to use a word, sorry, I'm going to use a trigger word. He said, the crazy's come for you, has it? I said, yes, it has. And he goes, I know what that's like. And and hearing that another person had been through it, and that, yes, indeed, there actually was a pathway out of it. I didn't have the ideas, so I just needed to listen to my doctor and just do what my doctor told me, and that, yes, indeed, it could get better. And what Liz was saying before, that since I've written this book, and it's interesting, I don't know if Instagram direct messages count as a telecommunication kind of digital service, but the main feedback I'm getting since I've written this book is, except for the fact that you're a guy and you interviewed Madonna, you told my story, and I thought I was the only person that felt this way. So that's one kind of feedback. The other feedback I get is, oh my goodness, my dad, son, brother, sister, wife, husband went through that either with alcohol or with psychosis, and I never understood what it was until now. And isn't that something that it makes me think? It's like, well, is it just like the equivalent of a sneeze? Is it our bodies have this way of reacting that's so similar? Why are we so afraid of it?
Yeah.
When it can happen to so many people.
Okay, just a wrap-up question. We do have to wrap it up. We've heard some really good news tonight about ways in which we're moving forward in increased knowledge in this area. What do we need to do though, Chris, to move forward? What more do we need to do? What are the barriers, if you like? This is called Stamping Out Stigma, this session tonight. What are the barriers, the hurdles that really we need to overcome to keep making progress?
That's a really interesting question. I think resources are certainly an important piece of the puzzle. Obviously, in the last couple of weeks, we've just learnt that in the past year, more people have died by suicide in Australia than has happened previously, and I think just even that in itself is an indicator that we need to do more around destigmatising help seeking and putting more funding into supporting programs that do reduce stigma. And certainly I think federally funded programs, it would be wonderful to see more federal funds going to organisations like Wellways, like Lifeline and like SANE to, I suppose, do what Beyond Blue has done for anxiety and depression and take this same educational and contact-based approach and open up that national level discussion around severe and complex mental illness to destigmatise help seeking for these types of experiences.
And Michelle, does the media need to lift its game as well?
I think the media has a really important role to play. I think they can help us by telling more stories of people living with complex mental illness, continuing to be a bit more responsible in the way that they talk about mental illness in the media. For the last 20 years, SANE has managed the Stigma Watch program. So we in Australia, we're actually really lucky. We have a really fantastic set of guidelines, the Mind Frame guidelines that have been developed by the team at Every Mind. And so increasingly our journalists have been trained in how to tell stories about mental illness responsibly, but occasionally they don't quite get it right. And so our Stigma Watch program often steps in and works with journalists to help them do that better. But you know, every time there is an article on the front page of a tabloid paper that attributes schizophrenia or psychosis to somebody's violent behaviour, that sets us back. And for individuals with lived experience of these issues, to see that play out on the front cover of a newspaper just makes them a little bit more afraid of the world around them and what's going on. So, you know, we need to open up these conversations around these severe and complex illnesses so that, you know, we get to a point where we just understand that people's brains are a little bit different, and that we have some compassion and empathy for what people are going through.
Absolutely. Great point to end the discussion on. It's been a terrific discussion. Thanks all of you for coming out tonight and having a chance to hear this. Please put your hands together for our fantastic panel. And I should say thanks very much to the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences for approaching me to come along and record this event tonight and host it. It's a fantastic opportunity to get more exposure to what is obviously a really important issue. So once again, thanks very much.